Imagine for a moment that the person who has been quietly directing the temperature of your life, deciding when you should feel guilty, when you should apologize, when you should doubt yourself, could be stopped in his tracks without you saying a single syllable. Picture the scene: a smile that once felt like praise now feels like a hook, a compliment that pointedly arrives at the exact moment you are vulnerable, the slow accumulation of hours where you find yourself explaining, justifying, shrinking. That realization hits like a cold clarity, and it changes everything. A manipulator is not a cartoon villain. They are a social technician who designs situations to extract emotional currency from you: attention, loyalty, compliance. Using the grammar of human connection, they understand the lever's guilt to corrode your confidence, praise to bind you, gaslighting to rewrite your memory. The technique matters more than the words, because they build patterns that look normal until you step back and notice the structure. If you learn to read structure instead of rhetoric, you stop being a participant in their play. You must understand one brutal truth: words give manipulators fuel. When you argue, explain, defend, or plead, you are handing them content to shape into proof that their strategy works. Every justification you offer becomes a new bead on their thread of dominance. They count on your verbal contributions because language is the raw material for narratives, and they are masters at weaving stories that pin you where they want you. Silence takes that raw material away. Silence is not surrender. It is not awkwardness or defeat. Silence is a presence so steady it becomes an argument in itself. When you stop filling the air, the manipulator's toolkit, insinuation, accusation, charm, begins to operate in a vacuum. In that vacuum, inconsistencies magnify and social mechanics that relied on reciprocity falter. The world notices a different rhythm. Your lack of response becomes a statement, and people recalibrate because human systems are built on response patterns. There is a simple neuroscience underneath this. Our brains are wired for emotional mirroring. Mirror neurons and affective circuits make you feel what others intend for you to feel. They turn small signals into large internal shifts. Manipulators exploit this loop, baiting your nervous system into proving their narrative true. When you refuse the reflexive emotional echo, when you withhold the physiological spike of outrage, fear, or shame, you break the reward schedule that trains the manipulator's behavior. Their machine runs, but it stops getting paid. Stoicism gives you an ethical and practical map for maintaining that silence without becoming cold or detached in the wrong way. The Stoic approach is not about emotionless hardness. It's about making your inner court judged only by facts and values you control. When you cultivate the habit of separating impressions from actions, observing what happens before deciding how to respond, you create a mental space where silence can be deliberate instead of panicked. That space becomes armor. Emotional intelligence complements stoicism by teaching you to see the manipulator as a signal, not a threat. You can learn their common patterns: projection, triangulation, the slow drip of flattery, so that you can predict their moves. Prediction substitutes calm for reactivity. If you know what they'll try next, their attempts merely confirm your model instead of collapsing your composure. You stop being surprised, and in that lack of surprise, there is power. Nonverbal cues are the silent language of social power. You don't need to say no when your jaw sets, when your shoulder squares, when your eyes steady and refuse to dart. Those micro behaviors carry more conviction than 1,000 justifications because they are hard to counterfeit in the heat of manipulation. Your body becomes an instrument of truth. Posture, timing, and the management of facial micro-expressions send a clearer message than any rebuttal could. Boundaries are social contracts with consequences, and silence is a way to enforce those contracts without escalating the drama. When someone violates a boundary, you can mark the violation by withdrawing your verbal participation, by becoming a closed circuit rather than a conduit. That withdrawal is visible and measurable in a social system. Others notice it and either fill the vacuum with scrutiny of the manipulator or ask for clarification. Either way, the manipulator's script is interrupted. Manipulators depend on audiences and predictable feedback loops. In groups, they thrive because their techniques, subtle slights, relational spinning, secretive alliances are designed to be invisible until they accumulate influence. You can neutralize that by quietly refusing to play along and by setting a tone that invites transparency rather than secrecy. Without the audience's complicity, their authority frays. That dynamic is especially powerful because humans are contagious. When one person models non-reactivity, others often follow. There's a tempting strategy called mirroring, where you replicate a manipulator's tone to make them comfortable or to reveal their intent. But an even sharper technique is to mirror absence, offering no emotional return at all. When you stop reflecting their bait, their social mirror cracks, and the images they need to justify themselves start to distort. That distortion creates uncertainty, which manipulators dread because it deprives them of narrative control. Uncertainty itself is a weapon. People who manipulate prefer predictable systems that they can game. Silence introduces ambiguity. Did you withdraw because you disagree, because you are hurt, because you are planning, or because you simply won't be baited? That ambiguity forces the manipulator into a position they dislike: interpretation. They must either make risky moves to restore certainty or pull back to reevaluate, and either path buys you time and leverage. Time is not neutral in these battles. Delayed responses are a form of silent communication that signals thoughtfulness and status. When you wait to respond, You indicate that you are not governed by the manipulator's timeline. That temporal control creates a reverse pressure. The manipulator must either escalate to achieve immediate goals or slow down to recalibrate, and both options expose them. By choosing when you speak, you choose the rhythm of the relationship. The environment is a stage, and manipulators are actors who build sets. If you quietly change the setting, moving a conversation into a public space, bringing witnesses, or altering the composition of a team, you alter the rules of their play. Manipulation often relies on private spaces and confidential atmospheres. Public light corrodes it. You don't need to announce a change. Simply arranging the context allows social norms to reveal what private coercion tries to conceal. Let me give you a small, anonymous picture. In a weekly meeting, a colleague systematically took other people's ideas and reframed them as his own, then smiled as others apologized and quietly receded. One person stopped explaining, stopped arguing, and instead leaned back with a calm face and slow breathing when the colleague started to perform. The effect was immediate. The room filled with an awkwardness around the thief's theatrics, and other people began to speak up in a way they hadn't before. The manipulator found his stage collapsing without a word of confrontation. Silence can be mistaken for weakness if it lacks intention. People will project guilt or indecision onto you if your silence matches posture with slumping shoulders or darting eyes. That's why presence matters. The same silence that disarms a manipulator will enfeeble you if it's accompanied by visible anxiety. Train your physiology, the steady breath, the anchored feet, the calm facial baseline, so that your silence carries weight instead of surrender. A nonverbal no is as audible as a shouted refusal when it's done with conviction. Turning your body away, refraining from the performative smile, allowing your face to stay neutral while your hands rest, these are all equivalent to a verbal boundary. They create an unmistakable atmosphere where the manipulator's lines no longer land. Discipline your small movements, your microsignals will keep the larger dance honest. Manipulators often work by setting up a status hierarchy where they sit above you by extracting concessions or attention. Silence can be a tool of status restoration. When you don't scramble to please or defend, you remove the evidence the manipulator uses to claim superiority. Others begin to see that the supposed dominance was performance, and status recalibrates. That recalibration is subtle but irreversible if you maintain the new baseline. When manipulators hit a dead zone of reaction, their internal logic breaks and cognitive dissonance follows. They cannot easily reconcile their expectation of control with the reality of your quiet refusal, and that pressure can lead them to do one of three things: escalate, withdraw, or self-adjust. Escalation is risky for them and often reveals ugly tactics. Withdrawal concedes ground. Self-adjustment collapses their scheme. All three outcomes are strategically useful to you. Preparation for silence is practical, not mystical. You cultivate it with simple daily practices: breath control to cool panic, journaling to clarify your values so that you respond from principles rather than emotions, and negative visualization to inoculate yourself against fear of unknown consequences. These small habits transform the reflexive person who gets swept into drama into the intentional actor who uses silence like a tool. Consider the ancient idea that inaction can be strategic action, like a river bed that lets water pass without erosion. Sometimes the strongest move is to allow the manipulator's waves to break against a shore that won't shift. Choosing not to react is choosing the terrain of the conflict. When the landscape favors you, their best tactics become poor investments of energy and social capital. Neutralization can also be proactive and quiet. You don't always wait for the abuse to occur. You can take low-key actions that reduce a manipulator's opportunities, document interactions, create transparent procedures, route communications through accountable channels, or invite others into conversations. These steps are silent because they require no dramatic exposure. They simply alter incentive structures so manipulation becomes harder and less rewarding. You can also let social proof do your work. People look to each other for cues about how to behave, so a subtle nudge, an ally who models non-reactivity, a team norm that emphasizes evidence over speculation, can be more powerful than any single confrontation. Manipulators are social animals. When the herd refuses to supply the performance, their tactics lose their currency. You can orchestrate that social change by small acts that cascade. Remember the moral framing. When I say destroy a manipulator, I mean extinguish their ability to harm you and others, not physical or reputational annihilation for its own sake. There's an ethical line where strategy becomes cruelty, and crossing that line often reveals more about you than about the manipulator. Your aim is restoration of agency and safety, not revenge. That moral clarity is part of the strength you must hold. There is one silent maneuver, a compact combination of presence, a calibrated look, and a contextual shift that produces rapid unraveling of a manipulator's control more reliably than any insult or expose. It is surgical rather than dramatic, subtle rather than theatrical, and it operates on the social algorithms manipulators rely upon. Most people never notice it because it requires practice in stillness, timing, and environmental shaping. When executed, however, it strips away their ability to reframe events. What's striking is that this move doesn't force a confession. It forces the social reality to reflect back the manipulator's structure in ways they cannot manage. They are left exposed, not because you shouted or shamed them, but because the social machinery that supported them, feedback loops, audiences, rapid reciprocation, stops feeding their narrative they try to repair. but that repair often reveals exactly what they were hiding. If you want to learn that precise method, the silent pivot that combines stoic non-reactivity, targeted micro-behavior, and contextual engineering, you'll need to practice 3 things I haven't yet revealed: the calibration of gaze that communicates non-negotiable boundaries, the micro-timing of pauses that collapse scripted replies, and the environmental edits that turn private theater into public test. Each is deceptively small but explosive when aligned. You probably feel the urge to shout back, to expose, to win a spoken argument. That impulse is human and understandable. It's also the manipulator's favorite outcome. The alternative I'm proposing requires humility and patience, a refusal to take the bait long enough to let the manipulator's own mechanisms undo them. It's not easy, but it's efficient, and it preserves your dignity better than any public demolition could. There is more to this than technique. Once you begin practicing silent strategies, you will encounter resistance from your own nervous system, from allies who demand drama, and sometimes from the manipulator who will escalate in unpredictable ways. Preparing for those responses is part of the skill, learning to interpret escalation as a sign of weakness, to accept social friction as the cost of boundary work, and to use documentation and alliance building as quiet reinforcements. In the next section, I will show you the exact choreography of that single silent maneuver, step by step, with examples of how it plays out in the workplace, in families, and in public spaces, and how to train your body and mind to carry it through under pressure. You will see why this works against people who have made a career of emotional engineering, and you'll be able to practice the micro habits that make silence into a decisive instrument. Are you ready to learn the move that overturns manipulation without a single spoken word? You already know silence can be a weapon. Now we turn it into technique you can execute under pressure. Imagine the very first second of an interaction as a mechanical hinge. The way you place your eyes, how you breathe, the tilt of your head, each micro decision is leverage. If you learn to move those small pieces with intention, you change the mechanics of conversation so fundamentally that whatever the manipulator plan next no longer connects to the architecture they depend on. Start with what most people ignore: the rhythm of your gaze. There is a difference between staring and witnessing. You want the latter. Let your eyes be patient and slightly unfocused at the edges, so your attention reads as steady thought rather than a glare. Hold attention a hair longer than feels comfortable. That extra fraction of a beat creates an internal pressure in the other person's mind, an invitation for them to fill the silence with more, often more revealing content. Your face is a radar. It communicates more than you think even when you say nothing. Build a neutral baseline that is alive but unhookable, slight relaxation around the cheeks, mouth closed but not tensed, brows resting above the eyes rather than pulled together. Practice making this face in a mirror until it becomes your default under stress. That way your silence reads as deliberate composure instead of confusion or shame. Breath changes everything in a room before you speak a word. When you lower your breath and let it sit in the diaphragm, your whole physiology signals calm. Slow breaths dampen the sympathetic spikes that manipulators seek to provoke. Learn a single breath pattern you can access anywhere. Slow inhale, gentle pause, long exhale, and use it as an internal metronome when things heat up so your silence remains steady, not hollow. How you hold your body anchors the interaction. Place your feet under your hips. Let your weight distribute evenly and keep your hands visible and relaxed. These small postural decisions reduce the micro movements that manipulators read as nervousness. Your stillness then becomes a clear message. You are present. You are not hurried. You are not an easy field to harvest. Micro gestures are the punctuation of silence, a fraction of second tilt of the head, a minimal nod, or a deliberate lack of smile can operate like commas and periods in a sentence you never speak. These tiny signals regulate attention. They tell observers what to notice and what to disregard. And when aligned with silence, they make the manipulator's spoken narrative look like an incomplete draft. Timing your pauses is an art as much as it is a tool. Humans are predictive machines. We want the next word, the next joke, the next apology. When you insert a calibrated pause at the exact moment a manipulator expects you to respond, you generate a prediction error in their mind. That error often forces them to supply extra detail, fill gaps, or restate themselves in ways that expose contradiction or motivation. Place your pauses purposefully after loaded statements or insinuations. Let them sit for a count you feel in your whole body. You don't have to manufacture an answer, just allow the silence to do the work. Often the manipulator will continue talking, offering new strands of their strategy. Because our species leans toward narrative completion, they'll try to sew the gap closed and end up revealing seams. Use the environment as a silent collaborator. Small spatial changes alter the social rules of an encounter: open doors, neutral seating, and visible note, taking shift attention away from private theatrics. A fluorescent lit conference table or a public cafe is not neutral. These backgrounds add social witnesses even when no one is watching, and manipulators are calibrated to exploit privacy. Change the context quietly and you change the incentives. Technology gives you leverage if you know how to use it. In digital exchanges, you can control timing and format effortlessly. Delay response to break the rhythm of emotional baiting. Write concise summaries that fix meaning in text rather than letting it float in conversation. And use group threads to create transparent records. These choices aren't about avoidance, they're about designing a structure where manipulation has fewer footholds. Preparation is often silent work that pays huge dividends in the room. Before key conversations, spend 10 minutes writing the facts you need to hold true, the outcome you want, and the non-negotiables you will not trade. This internal scripting stabilizes your silence so it's not reactive but purpose-driven. When the manipulator sees you refuse to be hurried, their strategies misfire into empty air. Allies turn your silence from an individual tactic into a social instrument. You don't need many. You need one reliable person who understands what you're doing and can support it without theatrics. That ally can mirror your calm, ask a clarifying question at the moment your pause ends, or simply be present in the room in a way that prevents the manipulator from monopolizing narrative control. Their presence reframes your silence as deliberate rather than isolated. Manipulators are adaptive organisms. When your silence creates a void they cannot easily fill, they will escalate in predictable physiological and behavioral ways, hurried speech patterns, sudden laughter that rings false, or compulsive pacing. Learn to read these micro shifts as diagnostic tools. They tell you where the pressure points are in the manipulator's model of control and where you can apply the next subtle intervention. Micro expressions are transparent even when a person believes they are concealed. Watch for brief lip presses, a quick blink pattern, an involuntary smile that doesn't engage the eyes. Those flashes are admissions of internal conflict or fear. When you maintain unruffled attention, these micro leaks become evidence, silent confessions that reveal inconsistency without your having to point a finger. Practice turns technique into habit. Set up drills that are simple and repeatable. Hold calm eye contact with a cashier for an extra beat. Sit through a short interruption without filling it, or watch a provocative comment without reacting. Start small, increase exposure, and keep a log of what you notice. Muscle memory will convert the effortful silence into an automatic tool you can deploy when stakes rise. Not all silence is noble. There is a difference between strategic non-response and passive avoidance. If you retreat into silence out of fear, you lose leverage and invite worse manipulation later. The aim is not to hide from conflict, but to choose the terms on which conflict can proceed. That requires internal alignment, clear values, and a long-term view so that your quietness is an instrument of sovereignty, not a shield you hide behind. There is a moral discipline to this work. You are not training yourself to humiliate someone. You are training yourself to limit harm to yourself and to others who might be affected by that manipulator's behavior. Keep that ethical boundary in mind as a compass. The goal is to neutralize harmful patterns, not to amplify cruelty. That restraint also strengthens your credibility with neutral observers who will often be the ultimate arbiters of social consequence. When the manipulator senses their old pathways are blocked, they often switch to flattery, appearing apologetic, or to playing the victim. These are tests. Your silence should not be brittle. It should allow you to watch which tactic they choose. Polite absence in the face of immediate charm prevents the fast repair they hope for. Consistent absence in the face of victim play forces them to either choose accountability or performivity. Both outcomes are informative. In families, the stakes of silence are different because ties are entangled with history. Use rituals to manage exposure. Host gatherings where roles are explicit. Assign shared tasks that break triangular dynamics, and rehearse short, calm scripts you can use when private manipulation begins. Over time, the household learns a new grammar of interaction that reduces the manipulator's space without nightly confrontations. At work, replace reactive email threads with transparent processes. Introduce agendas and minutes. Invite others to shared folders and use scheduled follow-ups that require documented commitments. These structural edits are silent because they do not call out anyone publicly in the moment. They simply make games of ambiguity harder to play. When leverage relies on unrecorded interactions, you neutralize it. Romantic relationships require a softer touch. Here, silence can be restorative instead of punitive. When a partner deploys guilt to coerce, begin by refusing to match the emotional tempo, a calm presence at the periphery of debate rather than immediate defense. Then, at a later predetermined time, speak from a place of clarity and only about facts and your limits. This split between silent containment and deliberate communication prevents reactive cycles from becoming entrenched. When manipulators escalate into aggression, silence alone is not sufficient. Safety is primary. If you detect reckless or violent behavior, prioritize physical and legal protections, remove yourself from danger. Notify authorities if necessary, and document incidents. The silent techniques are powerful, but they are not a replacement for concrete safety measures when the environment becomes hazardous. There is a training structure you can follow to internalize these behaviors, 3 weekly drills, each with incremental difficulty. Week 1 is observation. Notice how you react to minor provocations without intervening. Week 2 is practice. Deliberately hold the pause, maintain posture, and record how the other person adjusts. Week 3 is controlled exposure. Apply these techniques in a planned conversation where you have an ally or an exit. Repeat the cycle until the calm becomes reliable. Part of what makes this approach efficient is its economy. You do not engage in public drama. You do not create enemies unnecessarily, and you conserve emotional energy. That economy shifts social equilibrium gradually but powerfully. People notice a stable person who does not indulge emotional bait. They begin to treat you as a point of reference rather than a resource to be harvested. A surprising cognitive lever you can use is the human hunger for closure. Psychologists call this the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished actions occupy attention. By refusing immediate closure and allowing the manipulator's script to remain unresolved, you force them into a cognitive loop that often manifests as over-explaining or making errors. Silence exploits their discomfort with incomplete narratives and extracts evidence without accusation. Philosophically, you are practicing a form of negative capability, the ability to remain comfortable amid uncertainty without insisting on immediate answers. That capacity is rare and disorienting to manipulators because they profit from your anxiety. As you become more adept, you will find the world provides clearer social distinctions. People who are candid will gravitate towards you, and those who rely on covert control will find fewer footholds. Mistakes will happen, and when they do, there is a simple repair strategy, a brief, factual, written correction that restates agreed facts and next steps. This preserves your dignity while reestablishing boundaries, and it leaves a public record that is much harder to reinterpret. The written word, calm and precise, often completes what silence begins. If you are wondering whether all this is merely avoidance dressed up as strategy, watch what happens to the manipulator's network over time. They become less useful to others because their tactics require responsive partners. People begin to distance themselves because the manipulator's returns, attention, influence, rewards diminish without reactive supply. Your silence initiates a social pruning that often dissolves the manipulator's reach more effectively than confrontation. There is one final twist you must be ready for. The manipulator may attempt to weaponize your silence by spreading rumors about you being cold or uncooperative. Anticipate this by cultivating a few simple reputational anchors, a person or two who can vouch for your fairness, visible examples of your cooperation in other contexts, and a habit of brief, factual public records. These anchors neutralize the narrative attacks without you lowering your guard. Now you understand how to move the pieces, the subtle control of gaze and breath, the choreography of pauses, the architecture of context, the tactical use of technology, the training regimen that turns these into reflex. In the final segment, I will show you the surgical sequence you can perform in a single interaction, the exact micro timing, the micro expression to watch for as the manipulator begins to unravel, and how to convert that single moment into permanent structural change in a relationship. When you see that sequence, it will feel less like a trick and more like a quiet, inevitable correction to a social imbalance. The move itself is simple in outline but surgical in execution. First, you establish a non-negotiable stance that claims social ground. Then you perform a calibrated pause that functions like a clinical test of the manipulator's narrative. Finally, you convert whatever fissure the pause produces into durable structure so the behavior cannot recover. Think of it as stance, probe, and seal, three silent acts that together change the rules of engagement in a single interaction. Before you even enter the room, decide on a one-line mission that will anchor you mentally the whole time, something like observe facts, preserve calm, delay response. That sentence is not a mantra to repeat aloud. It's an executive order for your nervous system that simplifies choices. When your attention narrows to a single directive, your reflexes stop manufacturing reactive content for the manipulator to exploit. Choose the context like a chess player chooses the opening board. Small environmental shifts set different social rules. Bring daylight into a difficult talk. Invite a neutral third person without dramatizing why. Or switch a sensitive conversation to an email thread that timestamps statements. These adjustments are quiet but decisive. They convert private theater into accountable procedure and make the manipulator's usual advantages brittle. When you enter, take a single organizing breath and create a physical stance that reads as available but not consumable. Your body does not need to be rigid. It needs a deliberate minimalism. Spaced feet, relaxed shoulders, open palms lightly visible. That posture dissuades grabby social behavior without signaling aggression. It says you are present to engage on terms you set, not to be harvested. The moment you detect the first bait, a sarcastic aside, an insinuating question, a petty blame, implement the pivot, stop speaking, and hold the silence for a deliberately calibrated length. Use a mental count that matches your physiology, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, until the manipulator's script starts to feel incomplete. That specific stretch of silence is not empty. It is a diagnostic probe that forces the other person to either clarify, escalate, or expose contradiction. Watch for the exact micro leak that tells you which path they take. Micro leaks are tiny. A twitch at the mouth corner, a swallow that tightens the throat, a rapid blink, a half smile that doesn't reach the eyes. These flashes are admissions in real time. When you see them, resist the urge to name them. Let them accumulate into a narrative that you will translate into record later. If the manipulator seeks repair through charm or apology, accept the surface civility but maintain your silence long enough to see whether the change is procedural or performative. A true recalibration will shift behaviors in subsequent interactions. A performative apology will lack follow-through and ultimately provide you with objective evidence you can cite. Your quiet patience here separates signal from spin. When the silence produces a meaningful rupture, an admission, an extra detail, an awkward expansion, seal the moment with a short factual written follow-up within 24 to 48 hours. The follow-up is not an attack but a ledger entry. Describe what happened, name the observable facts, and state the boundary you expect going forward. Simple phrasing works best. Precise language prevents later reinterpretation and transforms an ephemeral moment into a stable artifact. Turn that artifact into structural change by creating mechanisms that reward accountability. Schedule a brief follow-up meeting with an agenda and minutes, add a standing item for clarifying ownership of decisions, or introduce a transparent communication channel that requires seeking relevant stakeholders. These are not punitive measures, they are infrastructural edits that make manipulation harder to repeat because they change incentive structures. Anticipate escalation and adopt graded responses that preserve safety and leverage. If the manipulator becomes theatrical or attempts to gaslight in public, keep your responses procedural and recorded. If they attempt reputational attacks, respond with documented facts and trusted witnesses. If their behavior becomes threatening, remove yourself and follow institutional safety steps. The silent tactic is powerful, but it sits inside a broader strategy where physical security and legal avenues are legitimate and necessary when danger appears. Certain environments require pre-agreed rituals to prevent cycles of manipulation, especially families and long-term partnerships. Pros time limited check-ins, rotating facilitators, or written house rules that everyone signs. When an argument arises, invoke the ritual pause, schedule a reconvene with a clear agenda, and avoid making major decisions in the heat of a raw encounter. Rituals create predictable scaffolding that naturally deflates manipulative improvisation. In romantic relationships, build a cooling clause into your conflict repertoire, a mutually agreed pause period during which both parties refrain from reactive escalation and commit to a structured time for calmer discussion. This prevents emotional bait from becoming a habitual lever and preserves intimacy by separating felt drama from durable negotiation. Make the clause practical, define length, location, and what can or cannot be discussed during the pause. Train your perception deliberately in low-risk settings so you can recognize manipulative patterns when they occur in high-stakes situations. Practice by watching brief clips or real conversations and noting tiny inconsistencies, delayed micro-expressions, incongruent smiles, mismatched effect. Name them silently and note how often they correspond to manipulative intent. Over time, your eyes will catch what your mind once missed. Retune your inner narrative about guilt and obligation, because manipulators often weaponize social emotions. When you feel the pull of should, or interrogate it with two simple questions: is this claim tied to a concrete fact or to a shifting social advantage? And would accepting this demand preserve my agency? Answering those questions converts guilt from an emotional trap into diagnostic data. Use behavioral exposure to rewire your limbic responses. Deliberately allows small provocations to occur while you practice withholding the immediate reactive script. Start with benign provocations, an offhand insult, a minor impatience, and hold your silence. Note the physiological signals that arise and stay with them until they diminish. This method teaches your nervous system that silence need not equal harm, and that composure is rewarded by clarity. When the manipulator tries to weaponize your silence by labeling you cold or unhelpful, preempt the narrative with strategic transparency in non-reactive forms. Share brief public examples of your cooperation in other contexts. Encourage others to speak about their experiences calmly, and keep a few allies ready to corroborate your procedural stance when necessary. Reputation is not abolished by silence. It must be managed through consistent fair behavior. Measure success not by dramatic victories, but by subtle, recurring changes, fewer manipulative interruptions, clearer meetings, increased number of decisions that are documented, and a personal baseline of reduced anxiety. Keep a simple log of incidents and responses and review it weekly. Patterns are the friend of prevention and the enemy of opportunists. Expect failure modes and prepare repairs. If you overuse silence and become distant to the point where honest feedback stops, recalibrate by initiating low-stakes vulnerability. Share a small factual feeling without invitation to manipulation, and observe whether the relationship can sustain direct, clean exchanges. If you find inconsistency in enforcement, your boundaries will unravel. Recommit to small, enforceable rules rather than sweeping prohibitions. Hold an ethical test before you deploy these moves. Would you use the same tactic with someone who has no power over you? If your answer is yes, you are acting from a place of justice. If no, you may be slipping into retaliation. Keep proportionality in mind. You are restoring equilibrium, not engineering humiliation. That moral clarity will preserve your credibility and keep the focus on protection rather than punishment. There is a higher level cognitive shift that underpins all of this. You are reclaiming epistemic authority, the right to define reality within the relationships you inhabit. Manipulators rely on being the interpreter of events. When you remove interpretive monopoly and replace it with documented facts, structured processes, and consistent behavioral responses, you transfer authority away from performative narratives back to observable reality. In practice, this method rewires not just interactions, but your inner life. You learn to trust silence as a form of speech, to prefer slow clarity over fast vindication, and to value dignity over immediate triumph. That internal shift reduces the frequency with which you attract people who feed off reactivity, and it increases the number of people who appreciate transparent adult exchange. Here's a short composite to illustrate the sequence. In a team meeting, a manager who habitually reinterpreted team ideas as his own began to press a junior for credit. The junior paused, held her index gaze without accusation, and allowed a 3-second silence. The manager filled the gap with details that contradicted his earlier public claims. The junior then sent a calm email to the group the next day, a factual note of what had been said and who had produced the original work copied to the project lead. The pattern stopped because the social system no longer rewarded the manager's habit, it rewarded clarity. The essential psychological revelation is this: manipulative power depends on participation, your verbal confirmation, your rush to justify, your production of evidence that fits their story. When you stop participating in that way, you do not merely deprive the manipulator of fuel, you change the informational ecology of the relationship so that their strategies no longer produce reliable outcomes. Silence, deployed with craft, is not absence. It is a relocation of the authority to shape reality. If you practice these moves, you will not only neutralize someone who extracts emotional currency from you, you will also emerge more solid, clearer, and less at the mercy of other people's drama. That outcome is the real prize, not the destruction of another person, but the restoration of your capacity to choose how you engage with the world. If this resonated and you want a guided set of exercises to practice the stance, probe, seal, sequence, let me know in the comments what environment you struggle with most: work, family, or romance, and I'll make a step-by-step drill. If you found these insights useful, like the video, subscribe for more psychology-based strategies, and share your experience below so we can learn from it together. Watch the next video on quiet power and emotional boundary setting to build the practical routines that lock these lessons in.